Good afternoon and welcome to HEC Records, our prestigious venue in the heart of central Paris. We're delighted to have you join us. My name is Daniel Brown. I'm the chief editor at HEC Paris Business School. And today we'd like to invite you to share a live exchange on the subject, Changing the Narrative on Gender Leadership. And we're honored to have a panel of 5 top-class personalities around this table who will be debating in front of a live audience also here in this auditorium, as well as a global public, thanks to the live stream that many of you have subscribed to. And I do want to immediately encourage you to send your comments and questions in this interactive one-hour exchange. So, our panelists today are in alphabetical order. Associate Professor Shahina Janju-Hajivraj, you're an HEC academic specialized in gender diversity and entrepreneurial leadership based in Qatar. Dawson Jope, you are a strategy professional and a globetrotter, but currently you've stopped to complete your MBA at HEC Paris. Dr. Marcelle Laliberté, you are a Chief Diversity Officer in this business school with over 25 years of managerial experience in fields well as diverse as the military, finance, and education. Thandiwe Mkechane, you are a South African chartered accountant who founded a women's fashion business 7 years ago, and you have recently started an MBA at HEC also. And finally, next to me, Audrey Cherkov, you've been managing director at the Women's Forum for the Economy and Society for exactly 1 year, and president as well of the Institute for Positive Economy. I'll be introducing further details on the background of each of our panelists as we go along. But I'd like to open the debate immediately by asking each one of you to answer this question, which is at the heart of our exchange on gender leadership. What key notions are each of you applying or analyzing or studying to change the narrative on leadership in terms of gender diversity in your professional or educational environments? And I will ask you to contain your initial answers to 2 minutes each. And let me start with my neighbor, Audrey Cherkov. You wrote a manual in 2020 which, among other things, calls for women to actually be at the heart of the strategy in terms of responding to the COVID crisis. For you, what place do you put in terms of gender and leadership?
That's a great question, Daniel. So hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to remind ourselves that the inequalities our modern world is facing haven't just come overnight, and they are not going to get cured overnight. Women have been fighting for their rights since centuries, right? So on one side, there has been tremendous progress over the last decades. Less girls are being forced into early marriage, more girls are going to school, laws are being reinforced towards gender equality. We see also, more women who have more possibilities to access position of leadership, and yet stereotypes still today are very, very much engraved in who we are, in our society, in our education, in our culture, in our world. So despite those gains, many challenges remain. So today, 2022, still in 34 countries, rape within marriage is still legal in 34 countries. Women, I think we can all agree on that, are not sitting at the decisions table yet, right? So yes, that's great. We have seen in the last century and a half great progress, and I would even say that we have seen a real and a strong opportunity for women and for girls, a real pathway. But it's still too narrow, too much at the top without giving the ordinary woman the power of choice. And my main fight today is really to ensure that women and girls have choice, because the most powerful gift we can give to any human being is the power of choice.
Thank you. Thandiwe, I'd like to turn to you. You describe yourself as an impact-driven chartered accountant from Johannesburg, as I said earlier. How have you seen the evolution of leadership in terms of gender diversity in your professional environment?
Thanks, Danielle, and hello, everyone. So that's an interesting one for me, Danielle, and I would like to answer it from two perspectives, right? So I have the professional life as well as the other professional life on the fashion side. So before I get started, I would like to start with a quote by Venée Meyers, where she says, "Diversity is being invited to a party, and inclusion is being invited to dance, to the dance floor," which really makes sense for me. I put this at the center of everything that I do in my professional life. So a notion that I would like to perhaps challenge is, the concept of inclusion, right? So from a business side of things in my fashion business, so my intention when I started Royalty Scenery was to celebrate and embrace the African culture through clothing. And I went on to do that, and then I realized that, hang on for a second, do I want to create a brand that is only targeting a specific group, or do I want to create a brand that everyone can relate to? And that's where I put inclusion as part of what I do with Royalty Scenery, that even if you are not an African, but you can still be part of the conversation. And then on the professional side, in my life working as an accountant in financial services specifically, what I have noticed is that we have definitely come a long way when we speak about women leadership. If you look at financial services, it used to be very male dominated. It still is today, but much better than it was, where you would see in a table, there's only men. But a notion that I still want to challenge, even post my MBA, is the concept of inclusion. So it's very much well and acknowledged that we have more women sitting on the table. Companies now are priding themselves for having more than 50% women representation. Then we would celebrate those companies. But we still need to dig deeper and see, are they actually including the women sitting on the table in strategic decision-making processes? Are those women empowered, and are they enabled to actually take the decisions that they are empowered to take? So that is the one concept that I still want to carry forward.
Thank you. Thandiwe, you have a fellow MBA student at this table as well, and I turn to Dawson Jope. As well as studying at HEC, you're widely traveled, bringing your professional skills in strategy, education, and telemedicine, even to countries like Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Iraq. What has been your experience in terms of leadership and gender diversity in all these activities?
Thanks, Daniel. I think the big thing is that, and probably everywhere I've been so far, you still see the same kind of narrative that leadership is still default in older cis male. That's just kind of what it is in almost everywhere. So I think fighting back against that and helping people understand that, opening up that discussion for as many voices and as many perspectives as you can, just means that you're going to have a far more well-rounded approach to your decision-making and everything that you do. So when I've been in positions, like I think about my time in Iraq, I was handed my positions in leadership by people that looked like me. So it was just older white men giving me power because they see someone who looks like them who will be like them. And I was a big fan of, and I mean I am now still certainly, just collaborative leadership and making sure that leadership is more than anything, creating space for all perspectives to be heard, to be comfortable. And sometimes it's not having the best idea, but it's maybe bringing an idea and letting other people build on it, or just making sure that people are comfortable to share their ideas so that when you're in a room, the best idea comes out. And the thing is, there's no pattern I think, as to where that idea is or where it comes from. It's just more that if you create that environment, you will certainly raise the potential for the best decision and the best result to come out, because you're making sure that all different groups are represented and basically the maximal amount of intersectionality is reached, so that you're allowing your organization to make the smartest move.
And we'll be coming back to, I think, a couple of examples of how you've applied that on the ground in, for example, northern Iraq, Kurdistan. I'd like to turn to you now, Shahina. Of course, a reminder that you are a HEC Associate Professor in Qatar, and you've just published your third book called Future Proof Your Career, which really centers on what you call cognitive diversity. In your book and teachings, how do you analyze changing this narrative on leadership in terms of gender diversity?
Sure, thank you, Daniel, and such a pleasure to be here and with such a great panel as well. So if we just think about COVID, Audrey, you said, you know, the challenges facing women existed pre-COVID, and at that point, we were talking about 70 years to achieve parity, and we know it's been pushed back by another generation. So it's a difficult situation. But if we think about COVID, it has presented us with an immense opportunity. In the leadership world, we call it's the impact of an exogenous shock. And it's a shock right to the core of organizations, right to their DNA, their culture. And in order to deal with this, we can't do what we were doing before. We need innovation. So collaboration is a huge part of this. I'm a big, big fan of innovation. I came into the diversity space because I was teaching entrepreneurship for 15 years. And the best creativity, the best innovation I saw happening when you had students from different disciplines coming together. And literally the friction of working together created new ways of thinking. So we can't talk about innovation without talking about cognitive diversity. And that's why for me, gender is the starting point. It's certainly not the end, but there's a huge gap between building diverse teams and then actually squeezing the value out of those teams through the leadership and the culture that's pulled into place. So what are the things that we're seeing at the moment? Innovation is absolutely critical. We're seeing more male leaders stepping up, and we're moving away from the why are we having these conversations to the how do we make this happen. But actually we need to keep sharing examples of good practice, and a big, big piece for me is really having evidence-based research, evidence-based practice, data-driven practice, because there's a lot of good feeling and goodwill about this, but we actually have to drive data to be able to show the impact, because essentially we're asking people to shift their behavior. We're asking people to perhaps give up positions to make way for women to come in, and changing behavior is incredibly hard work. You need to have the evidence to show that it's actually going to work, and we're still waiting and waiting for that data to really demonstrate the impact of gender diversity. And Tandiwi, I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but I have a little bit more to add to your poem about inviting to the dance. It's even more important when people ask you to show them your dance. So we move from tolerating to celebrating diversity.
I love the image of dance and partying, and just to further that point about statistics being vital, I mean, there are studies that show that companies with women executives are 30% more likely to outperform other companies, for example. And all the references and statistics that I might be giving will also be online after the exchange that we have. Finally, in this initial round of exchanges, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Marcelle Laliberté. On top of your work at HEC, you continue to research issues like increasing visibility of women, for example, in aerospace, as well as diversity, inclusion, and equity in higher education. And you teach a class on all these key questions. So I'd like to ask you, how do you approach the question of changing this narrative on gender leadership?
Well, thank you, Danielle, and it's been wonderful to hear all your different answers. From my point of view, what I like to look at is first the individual. What are the characteristics? How does that person fit within the organization? Then the organization itself, so the cultural aspects of the organization. And finally, what's the frame? What's government policy? What's the legal framework around that's sort of influencing what's going on? And so when we looked at with the Women in Aerospace Association, we were looking at how do we increase visibility of women in conferences, such as this, for example. And it was not just the individual, like a confidence issue or maybe time management. It was also What are we putting in place as an organization and the culture to allow that conference to occur? And what is the framework around it? And so, for example, if we wanted to change the narrative, how do we use this conference to change the narrative with our audience? We have active participants and we have passive participants. How do we engage with the sort of the passive participants so that they feel maybe more confident to come here at a later date? And it's sort of that discussion of how do we change the narrative when I understand sort of the three levers that I can work with. And that's sort of the research that I've been working on for now.
Fascinating. Well, that's the first round of our exchange. And now I'd like to invite our audiences to join the dance and to participate by bringing up any points that this has provoked or asking further questions. You'll have a second chance later on. And the person masterminding this is the seventh person at the table, Oriane Savarez. Oriane, I don't know if there are any points yet that have been sent in or not, but would anyone in the audience like to ask a question or bring a point in this? We want to encourage this interactivity. Yes.
Hello, thanks a lot for your presentation.
One moment, sorry, the microphone's about to arrive.
One of my question is, how do you make sure that you engage men in this fight? Because for many decades we've been like fighting as women associations, like to increase our visibility, but now we believe that we need men to actually bring this on the table. So how in your research, in your actions, do you tackle with this topic?
Well, actually, Shane, you actually mentioned that goodwill is perhaps not enough. Perhaps
Absolutely.
You'd like to answer?
So I've been working in this space for the last decade, and my starting point was always about innovation. It's not enough that it's the right thing to do. It's not enough that 50% of the population is female. It's what I was saying about shifting behaviors. So whenever I was talking and working with senior male leaders, I always talked about the end result being innovation, and to get there, this is what you need behind the scenes to achieve that desired goal. And in all of that time, there was only one team that challenged me, and it was a French individual who said, no, this is the right thing to do. It's not about the result, which was interesting because everybody else agreed with me eventually because we focused on the end goal. And I think we have to really be quite clear about this, and we see examples of this in other countries as well, about the bottom line, about the impact on it. You talked about the data. There's some research that shows when you have diverse teams at senior leadership level from a gender perspective, you have a 20% increase in innovation. From an ethnicity perspective, it goes up to 35%. When you are, this is about changing behaviors and it's about resources, so you do need to be able to talk about that return on investment. It may seem uncomfortable, but we're in the world of business and that's what counts.
Audrey?
Yeah, well, it's quite funny because since the past 12 months, I've been asked many times, but are men invited to the Women's Forum? And my answer is straightforward, hell yes. And if not, we would lose the fight, So the same way, I said earlier that women are not sitting at the decision tables yet. We should, all of the women here, running association, working, on this topic, make sure that we include men. And one of the strongest testimony I've heard actually was from Jean-Pierre Clamadieu, who's the president of the Conseil de Surveillance of ENGIE, which is a listed company in France. And he said, he was talking about the recruiting process, to hire the general manager of ENGIE. And he was saying, in his own words, that he absolutely wanted to be extremely diverse in his process of recruiting, but it was also a business matter, competitive matter, and so on, and that he was extremely proud of the hiring that they've made, and it's a woman for the second time. But I'm saying that because it's very important, to have women, to have men talking about their own experience, because they are the best advocate, and we shouldn't forget that men are also the father, the brothers, and the son, and that they definitely have lots of stories to share, and that's also one of the reasons the Women's Forum exists, is to give the floor to the men, and there is one who's going to talk just now. Yes.
Someone in the public, yes.
Okay, Emeritus Prof at HEC Paris for been in the school for more than 30 years, and I am a specialist of human resource issues. I fully agree with what you said. All studies shows that the more women you have on the top level of organization, the higher level of performance. In innovation, you're right, more diversity, and I would say other forms of diversity also, not only gender. The question is, why are we so late in the movement towards more diversity? France is a very interesting country. We are the leader in the world to have more women on the board, 46%. And the law was 40%. Sorry?
Because of quotas.
Yeah,
it
quotas.
helps.
Now there is a new law passed December 2021 called Rixin law that states that in 2026 companies above, I think, 1,000 or 3,000 people should have 30% of women in senior management ranks, and in 2029, 40%. So the question is, do we have to pass laws to force, mindset, collective mindset to change? And I think in business schools, we had to work a lot on these issues. And and the last thing, because I am a specialist of HR processes, I do think that it starts with all the processes we have in place in the companies. And just to give you an example, in Areva, now it's called Orano, they had a process for senior talent management, how to identify what it's called personnel reviews, that are the discussion between managers and HR. Always women were looked at the beginning of each meeting before the men. Interesting. First the women, the potential leaders, and then the men.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure that everyone here on the panel will try and answer this big why, but let me start with Marcelle.
I'm going to give you two elements. Yeah. One from my own research that I've done in education. So the relationship that the state has with its universities. The parallels are very interesting in this front because the aha moment for me in my research was the role of state. Hence the reason why I always look at that lens from sort of far behind, because what I found in this context of France, the state plays an important role. If we want to see real change, then the government has a real role to play on this front. You wouldn't be able to replicate that scenario in another country. So we have to adapt our approaches to what the context of our country gives us. And so on this front, it's good news. Maybe it's disappointing to see that it takes a government to do it, but on the flip side, it's being done. So there's a voice being heard, and we adapt. The second part of the discussion I think that's important is we talk about the measurements. We have the percentages, but then what are the behaviors that are changing? When I come back to the example of even the visibility of women on conferences, what behaviors are we trying to change? And what are we looking at? Is it just the panelists? Who's involved in putting the conference together? All these wonderful people behind here, the members who participate in the conference, and each piece has a role to play, but we're not looking at all those different dimensions. And these are things that we need to sort of start measuring and looking to see how our behaviors are changing. And that takes more time. I think this is where we're still sort of need to recognize that things don't change overnight, but how do we start looking at those different behaviors and measure those behaviors?
Dawson, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit more, I guess. I think a lot of it too is, it's how do you shift inertia from what it's been for so long? If you have one system of things being a certain way where people pass down power, and then whether or not it's explicit or implicit that power is given this way, there's a lot of different ways that I think you have to address it, and I think a big part of it too is just that there's a lot of subtext of ego in it too, often. So it's like change always has to be approached with a degree of humility, and so not just the people who are trying to bring change, like everyone sitting here, but also there's the hope that people who are sitting in positions of power are open to that discussion, which can be very difficult too. So I think there's a key element of humility as well. Another thing, this is a bit more abstract, but I read a book by this author about half a year ago, and it took me like a week even to start the book because I was staring at the title, and the title was so good I couldn't even open the book. And the title was, it was an American author, Audre Lorde, self-described black lesbian warrior poet, but the title of the book was "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." And I thought that idea was just really huge because part of the idea is that to force these changes that we need to see happen, you can't use the tools that have been given to you to force a change. You have to approach change in a way that it needs to happen. And the thing is, people in power won't necessarily give you the space to change in the way you need to.
They don't relinquish it easily. Audrey.
Yeah, I just wanted to answer you that yes, it's a fact. If we look at the countries that have adopted coercive measures, they have definitely, without exception, substantially narrowed their gender gap. And every year with the Women's Forum, we are releasing what we call the Women's Forum Barometer. So it's a survey that we do in the G20 or in the G7 countries. And a couple of months ago, we've released the latest edition. And I really wanted to use it actually to test people's willingness, the citizens, the men and the women, willingness in their country to see coercive and mandatory measures implemented. So we went and we asked people, would you support in your country the introduction of legislation to ensure that women would have the same access to economic and social capital? Then we went a bit further and we've asked them, would you like to see published the list of the companies in your countries who are not respecting equal pay? Okay? And the third question was even stronger. Would you support high fines on those same companies? And I was very surprised because 89% of the people said yes. And it's interesting because sometimes, you know, like our political leaders, our economic leaders are afraid to take measures because of the public acceptance. But here we see that in a way, you know, the civil society is maybe more mature than our leaders. And my second point, just very quickly, is the talent pool. You know, we can't, you know, put a huge pressure on companies, you know, saying, okay, you know, like in whatever you're doing, not even looking at the sectors or the DNA of your business, you have to have 50-50, 50% women, 50% men, you know, at every step of the way. You know, without working on the talent pool, without making sure that they would have access to the right female talent. So it's also, you know, like making sure that we work on the bias, on the stereotypes, you know, on the education, and not only on the emerging part of the iceberg. That's why we need to work with the private sector, but that's why we also need to work on the legal frameworks. So it's really, you know, like a collective answer.
And yet the statistics in terms of education are interesting. I mean, according to a global gender gap report, 41% of women achieve a tertiary, a university level of education, compared to 36% of men. So the talent pool appears to be there. But that's another question. Oriane, there are some online questions.
And what we just said right now is actually a great transition to this question, because of course, also we talked about the talent pool being here, but what about the representation of and the inclusion of women at all levels? And I was, as you said, Audrey, giving ordinary women the power of choice. The question I have is, what will motivate individuals to take on leadership roles? What are those internal tools that Dawson was talking about that women and other people from diverse backgrounds can leverage to take on leadership?
I have an answer, but maybe anyone else want to start?
Shahina?
Yeah, I can.
So I think, you know, when we talk about leadership, it's about having a sense of purpose, wanting to bring about change. You know, as a leader, you have the opportunity to bring about change. I think what I sometimes see happening is because somebody is a woman or somebody is from a diverse background, it is assumed that's their expertise rather than their leadership skills. And I think we have to be very, very careful that individuals are recognized for their leadership capabilities, which again can be learnt, developed, honed in over time. And if it just so happens they're a female or it happens they're from a diverse background, that's additional, but that's not their expertise. And actually this is a very, very current conversation because we're reading and hearing about a lot of people who are burnt out because they are expected to provide the solutions for diversity leadership. And this is why I said earlier, it's not enough just to say, so-and-so is a woman, therefore she has all the answers. And we saw this very much after the Black Lives Matter movement, that if you came from an Afro-Caribbean background, you were assumed to know what to do within the workplace. It has to be evidence-based. And one of the biggest challenges I've seen, and the reason why the diversity agenda hasn't moved as quickly as it has, it's actually because it's filled with very well-meaning, well-intentioned individuals who don't always have the data, and therefore it comes from passion, which does burn out, rather than evidence-based.
Tandiwe, do you feel this pressure on you as someone from South Africa, highly qualified and in the fashion business?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So for me, I think, to maintain the motivation, because getting the motivation at first, I think that's easy. We can easily all get motivated, but it's maintaining the momentum. To get there, you really need to have a purpose that is not self-serving. It needs to be bigger than you. You need to do it for not just you, but for other people. Either people that you are serving with in a company or people that are still to come, right? There's a concept of lift as you rise. So as you take another step in the ladder, you need to make sure that you're bringing up the people that you are leaving behind. So coming to the motivation again, I think, so firstly, it needs to be bigger than, self. So leadership is not about a self-serving, goal. You need to be serving either a broader community or fighting towards a common cause with other people. And then secondly, I think it's important that we don't forget our responsibility, men and women, that we have a huge responsibility to ask. So firstly, on the women's side, if we want to get support from other women and other men, we need to step up and ask for help. That's a very important thing, because people are more than willing to help, but they won't just help you out of the blue. You need to go and ask. And then secondly, on the men's side, the asking would be coming from points of clarifying. So if you are not clear about something, you feel like maybe I might be overstepping in topics like diversity, gender diversity, ask so that you are clear, so that you can also be in the dance floor. You can be involved in the discussions like this, because if you hold back and make assumptions, you won't know, and you'll miss out on an opportunity for you to actually be a change maker. And we need more of those people.
I see other hands shooting up in the public, but unfortunately we have a second round of questions, and then we'll again open it up to the floor and we can come back on all these points. And I'd like to start with Marcelle, with you, because your research, as we said earlier, includes exploring student engagement, social justice, diversity and inclusion projects. For you, what are the priorities for building leadership in organizations, businesses over the next, let's say, decade?
I'm going to take from Dawson and Tandiwe's both points in terms of collaboration and asking for help. And I'm a big believer in student engagement, responsible student advocacy, student engagement, and I believe that those notions translate well to the company, in the sense that engagement by definition is, what is the time and effort that I'm putting in to achieve a certain goal? For the company or the school that I'm in, what are the resources, the curriculum, the mission that I'm putting in place to help that person achieve their goals? And so for me, that student engagement is an interesting notion to translate to leadership, because the leader is that pivotal point between the individual and the organization, the crossroads of how does that make a difference or not in terms of addressing leadership on the collaborative approach, allowing the space that someone can say, I can ask for help. Because that space has to be created, but you have to be able to feel that you can engage with the organization and with leadership to be able to ask for help.
Shahina, I'd like to quote a psychology professor called Leslie Brody, who said back in 1994, when it comes to leadership and management, women, quote, tend to lead in circles rather than pyramids. One elaborates, someone else suggested that women move towards the creation of a cooperative environment within a company, and men, on the other hand, create a competitive and hierarchical atmosphere within the organization. This is back in 1994. Perhaps it needs updating. But how does such a reflection inform decision-making at a leadership level?
Okay, so it's a really great question, because first of all, we need to be really careful about stereotypes. And more often than not, I'm asked, well, is there a female model of leadership and a male model of leadership? And we can really get caught up in the whole debate around this. So I think we need to recognize it's about treading a very narrow path. Now, wearing my geeky academic hat, I spent some time during COVID really thinking about why have we ended up where we've got to in terms of leadership models? And it was one of those aha moments. I was speaking to a colleague and I said, you do realize that the research we use, the research we teach, the material you study, the models are based on what? The respondents were white, predominantly middle class or upper class men. Those are the models of leadership we've had for centuries. And actually, we now have to start thinking about different models of leadership. We need to I'm going to say it again, we need to back it up by research. And as I was thinking about this, I had an experience in my second book, which was about championing women leaders. We had a number of women we interviewed who, just before the book was due to come out, because they were facing crises in their leadership, in their organizations, they pulled from the data, they pulled from the book and said, we can't be in the book, we don't want to be in the book. So we also have a responsibility to be part of this model and creating new narratives around research. So we recognize the models need to be changed. And we also need to then really think about innovation. So back to the collaboration piece being so important. We can only really start creating new models of leadership and understanding the value of innovation when we don't do what was done before. And right now there's a really big trend towards thinking about entrepreneurial leadership, about thinking differently. What we do recognize, if women and men are recognizing that there are different ways in which we work and different approaches, it's about asking for help. So Tandiwe, your point about asking for help is so critical. There's some really great research that shows in the first 6 months of COVID, countries run by women performed better than countries run by men. Just think back, the first 6 months of COVID, we had no idea what had hit us. We had no idea what resources we needed. We had no idea where we were going. So in the face of extreme uncertainty globally, the countries that were run by women, when compared to their counterparts, they perform better. So there is a model emerging which suits men as well as women, and that's something we need to focus on and be more open to the innovation piece and asking for help and certainly the collaboration piece.
Yeah, leaders in New Zealand and Germany, for example.
And a number of others as well, yes.
Audrey, I'd like to turn to you with this similar sort of question about pyramids versus circles. I mean, for many years you've been promoting a fairer and more inclusive world for women and future generations. Do the challenges you faced reflect this distinction about approaches from men and women leaders as described, circles versus pyramids?
Well, first of all, I think we are at a time in our history where we are facing such great challenges. You know, if we only take the example of the environmental challenges, you know, the global warming issues, we are never going to solve anything with half of the talent involved, with half of the visions involved, with half of the population, right? Especially knowing that 80% of the climate refugees are women. And yet, you know, they should be involved in the solutions, and they are not. If we look at the percentage of ministries who head up environmental ministers, or even if we look at the composition of the COP, you know, like women are not even a third, you know, of the leaders. So I would say that more than ever, we need to make sure that women also think that they are able to do it, because it's something that we have not answered to your question, but role models. To me, it's key, because it's very, very difficult to become something if we don't know that it exists, right? And actually, I was having a very interesting discussion with a woman minister in our country, in France, and she told me that she saw a movie, you know, like when she was very young, with a woman minister, you know, and she was extremely busy and she was doing fascinating things. So it, you know, like she projected herself. So the more and more we are going to see women leading companies, leading countries, the more we are going to get used to it, and the more we are going to think that, yes, it's possible, and the more we are going to see that it has a positive impact on our world.
And your Women's Forum brings together so many inspirational models, role models, and not just once a year in November. The work is all through the year. Absolutely. Yeah. I'd like to turn to Dawson. Since you've worked long periods in mixed and multicultural teams, as I said earlier, in Sierra Leone, also in Kurdistan and northern Iraq and Rwanda, amongst others. In the latter, you encouraged, for example, bold initiatives like running Iraq's first weekend youth camp for both boys and girls. What has been your observations about leadership and gender in these very different cultural environments to the ones that we live in the West?
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great question. I think just as a very immediate thing to contrast the two, in my experiences, I think that the patriarchy is just as strong in the West, but it's better disguised. So I think you see a lot of the same structures, but it's more nuanced. But also, I think there's some interesting contrasts too, where you have, again, I'm speaking more experiential than actual hard data here, really. But Western nations might, on average, be more progressive in a lot of their belief sets. But then if you contrast that with, say, the pyramid structure of the populations in these cultures, they tend to be a lot more old, a lot more advanced in their age structures, whereas a lot of these countries, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, great examples, and Iraq too, very young populations. So there's a real thirst for new ideas. And being that it's in a global world, they might have somewhat more conservative cultural structures, but they have the same access to information and leaders and insight that a kid in Los Angeles is getting. So you have maybe greater conservative structures that are in place in these cultures, but you have a lot more youth thirst. And so I had friends in Kurdistan, for example, who are running a brand new LGBTQ organization in Duhok, a city I lived in for 2 years, and the stuff that they were doing was incredible. And the thing is, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, that's something that would have had to be undercover, but is now very openly done. So I look at that, or with the example of the youth camps we tried to run. We did it 1 year, and it was just boys, just teenage boys. Took 15 boys off campus, away from home for the weekend, which is a huge deal to do, even for boys. And that was a great experience, and it was kind of a leap forward for a lot of people. The next year we did it again with the boys, but then about 2 weeks after that, we did it with girls. And not only that, we had the women on campus who were running it with some of us men behind the scenes to provide support if needed, just because we had now had the experience of doing it twice and had some structure. And the end result was the women's camp was way better. It wasn't even close. It was way better. And it was just, partly it was because they loved the opportunity to show that they could do it. But also it was that they were looking at it from a lot more angles than I realized that a lot of the men on our team were looking at to set up the same idea. So it's, what I've noticed, I guess more than anything, is that the desire, the hunger is equal everywhere else. There's different barriers to entry in the West versus non-Western cultures. And the innovation is happening in different ways, but that's just indicative of things like, more or less conservatism or more and less youth driving the process.
And the speed, for example, of adopting new technology like smartphones and the investment of this youth is very telling. In, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, Ghana, for example, being one of the world leaders. Thandioe, finally, the Royalty Scenery company that you founded aims to empower women through shared fashion knowledge and experiences. In this creative industry, how is this notion of circles and pyramids playing out?
Thanks again, Daniel, for that question. So I would say in the creative space, so let me start with the notion of circles around female leaders. This is not something new, by the way. This is something that dates back centuries ago, where you found that, in communities, a voice of one woman was not enough. So what women used to do, they would just gather like other women who, who believe in the same cause, and then collectively they would say, this is what we present, and only then they would be listened, if they get listened. So this is way back. So this is something that we've seen, being passed on from generation to generation, and thank God for us who are here today. We have social media where one voice can be enough. But the concept of being in a circle or in a part of a group is still more powerful even today. Hence, you find that people, even in workspaces, at work, you'd find that there's kind of like people who always sit together, always discuss ideas together, and that's where it comes from. So even in the creative industry, now it's phrased as collaborations or partnerships, but it's essentially the same concept, that there is more power in numbers. When you do something with other people who believe in the common, in the same thing, then you can achieve a better goal, either in the form of profits or either in something even non-financial, as like the social impact that you would have in the community. And then on the pyramid side, I think, Danielle, the whole thing about competing is something that we see in every human being. Like, we are all competitive in one way or another. But I think in a corporate culture, you would find that, men tend to chase, let's say, for example, the next position. And then in that competition, they would be looking at the men next to them and say, okay, this is who I'm competing with, therefore we need to fight and see who gets there first. But I think it's also changing, right? Because you see that everyone acknowledges the fact that if you don't work together, you choose to work alone, you will benefit. Surely you will benefit alone, and you'll probably get to a specific goal alone, but it does no good for the company and the other people around you. And the people who get there, like the fastest, or get to the most top position, tend to be lonely and have no support from the other groups, because they feel like, we've pushed you, we've supported you to get to where you are, but there is no benefit for the people that you are leaving behind. So I love what's being encouraged in the creative space in the form of, bigger brands collaborating with someone like me who's unknown in the industry, but you have the drive, you have the passion, you have the skills, then they would say, come along. What do you have to offer? How can we bring you into our value system without compromising our values and your values, but we sort of find a common ground?
Yes, the corporate spirit that gives power thanks to numbers, and it comes back to your first answer about engaging the community, so very open-minded. And talking about open-minded, I'd like to immediately turn to our live audience, and there's the first question just behind the lady.
My name is Rini. I guess this is around information that Daniel shared, but anybody can answer this question. So we do see, even pre-COVID, like a lot more women have access to education and are graduating from schools and universities. But in India, for example, we see like fewer women are now joining the labor force than a decade ago. So I guess my question is, how does the role of education change? And like especially in economies where upward mobility is present, but it's highly skewed.
And perhaps right in front of you, there's another remark or question that you might like to add so that we get more voices in. Sorry.
Yes. First, thank you so much for this fruitful conversation. I would like to raise the point of women entrepreneurs. I saw this surprising data of how women struggle to raise funds. Like only 2% of all women in entrepreneurship manage to raise funds, while it's 80% for men. And in the same time, women are not only it's not good for the performance, but also for climate change. We were talking also about it. So how can we support women to tackle this issue? And the second point I wanted to address is about imposter syndrome and the importance of fostering confidence. Because I noticed, like, I'm 22, I'm a business student, and like mainly my female friends have this imposter syndrome, and I believe that there is nothing more powerful than your thoughts, and that it is important to foster this confidence. And we were talking about role models, but that girls should know that they are capable.
Wow, many questions here. I'll throw it to the panel. Who would like to first answer one of them or several?
So I'll start with the education. So my thing is education, and education has a critical role to play in all of this. You're right in the statistics in terms of there's more women or female representation in education, but it's not reflected down the pipeline. So I think a lot of the points that were shared today was how do we change sort of what's going on within that pipeline? Because the dimensions that are affecting women are around time constraints that we have, the burden of care that many women carry today. And COVID has certainly highlighted that burden of care in terms of education for the children, elderly care, and all those dimensions. So how do we address those in the education framework? And for universities and schools in general is rethinking our approach, not just today, but what's going to happen tomorrow. What are the consequences, and what is our fundamental mission as a higher education institution? We've had models that have worked over 1,000 years. Universities have been around since the dawn of time. But on the flip side, we've been built on a certain model, and today it's shifting. And how do universities respond to that shift? And address it not only internally, but also externally in how it manages with its constituents. And so that's why we've seen a proliferation of chief diversity officers, case in point. We've gone up from, I want to say, even 3 years ago, it was around 40%. Today we're around 60%. So we're holding ourselves accountable too in this discussion. And that role of education is part of holding ourselves accountable, asking those questions and pushing the knowledge of what people like Shahina do, for example, or professors that we have here present, is challenging and allowing for the debate so that new ideas can be generated. So that's my little sort of blurb on education, but happy to share the floor with others on this discussion.
Shahina.
So just so I don't give Daniel such a hard time, I'm going to pick up the education piece really quickly and then move on to another question. I think, and it really follows on from what Marcelle has just said, education is an amazing catalyst for social change. Where we need to shift the conversation, the pipeline really important, but it's about the organizations fixing themselves, shifting from fixing the women to organizations taking responsibility. We have a lot of companies or organizations that are very good at attracting women. They have to work even harder to retain and promote women. And so the points you've talked about are critical, but organizations, leaders really have to take a lot of responsibility in terms of what they're doing to pull that pipeline through. And there's so many ways we could discuss this, but that's just my very quick perspective on it. I'm going to pick up the point about imposter syndrome because I think it's really powerful as a way of explaining and understanding the challenges women face. And I'm going to say something that might seem a little bit controversial, but it's coming from a good place. I think sometimes we hide behind these labels, and I have come across more and more over the last few years where women say, oh, I have imposter syndrome. And it's like, well, that's it. I have imposter syndrome, so I couldn't possibly do it. Well, the piece is about challenging. You know, the research I've done around women in leadership, role models are critical, senior leaders are critical. Stretch opportunities, getting yourself so far out of your comfort zone. And if you use imposter syndrome as a reason not to, you stay in that space. So the role modeling, diversity of role models is so important, and telling yourself it's so terrifying, but I'm going to do it, and hopefully I will fail a little bit and I'll learn from it. And you know, it's not just a female thing, it's a male thing. So when we take that away and start looking at it from a self-efficacy point of view, from pushing and testing ourselves, then actually we're going to allow ourselves to fail. We'll learn from it, and we'll get back up better, bigger, and more stronger and more resilient for leadership.
Powerful, thank you. Finding mistress tools to dismantle the master's house. Yes. And it's scary, but exciting at the same time. Audrey.
Well, so I would like to answer the second question. I agree with you, Shaina, on the fact that we shouldn't hide, behind that imposter syndrome. At the same time, like we have to face the fact that we are living in a very stereotyped world again. And, I love to share that story because to me it was, like really, like it was a shock. I was having that conversation with my 6-year-old daughter about a year ago about Thomas Pesquet, who's the French astronaut. And naturally I asked her, so would you like yourself to become an astronaut? And she answered to me, like very quickly, and she told me, I can't, I'm a girl. You imagine knowing my job, that she, like is evolving in a very fair environment. So, but you know, that means that sometimes we miss, you know, the bias or again the stereotype that we are going through, and it's maybe only because she has only seen, you know, like men's picture, you know, wearing the outfits, and then she thought that it was not possible. So again, it's really about spreading the word as well. And if we go back to the figures, because you said 2%, but on a global scale, we have 224 million women entrepreneurs, and they have access only to 1% of the public or private funding. So this has to change. I'm quite optimistic because, again, because of the coercive measures, because now it's becoming so much ESG compliant. You know, like if you're a startup or a corporate and you want to attract investments, anyway, you need to have a very balanced leadership, and you need to invest in balanced portfolio. So I hope we are going to sit in the same room in 5 years' time, and that it's going to be a bit more positive.
So the meeting is already reserved for 2027 then, after the Paris Olympics. Oriane, there's some questions online also.
Yes, indeed. Well,
your microphone, sorry.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. So we have talked a lot about role models, and as you might know, people come here to listen to people who are experts on the subjects, and and this is also why we're doing those kind of events. It is to inspire and to give people something to look up to. But who has inspired you? What has influenced your thinking around leadership, diversity and inclusion, and what motivated you into being an advocate for change?
Well, let me turn to the younger generations at first, Thandiwe.
Thanks for the question. So for this one, I might look like I'm thinking about it because I'm thinking about it. And the reason is I've been inspired by, you know, a number of people throughout my journey. So when they say it takes a village, it took a village to build this, literally. But on the business side, I would say my source of inspiration, even from when I started, is my mother. She's late, but you know, in the time that I spent with her, she was, you know, someone who embodied, like she had this rebellious thing about her, like a defying strength, that she would always challenge the, you know, status quo, that she wouldn't go with what's given to anything that's given to her unless she agrees with it. So from there, as a young child, I learned that, you know, you don't just go with whatever, you don't follow the trends or follow whatever the majority is following, but you need to think about what do you actually want? What do you want to achieve? So from an early age, I knew that, you know what, growing up as an adult, whether I end up, you know, as an accountant or whatever. By the way, as a child, I've always wanted to be a nurse somehow. So I thought, you know, becoming a nurse, when I get there, I would be the kind of a nurse that knows what she wants and knows what she wants to achieve. I won't just follow what's written on the book. So she was like, she played a very instrumental role in me starting this. And also she was a woman of style, if I can just mention. So this is also, you know, inspired by her. And then on the professional side, which is, you know, it came in as I grew, like from high school to university to working and now being at HEC doing the MBA. So I've been inspired by, you know, a lot of women. Like everywhere I go, I always find someone who I would call it, it's almost like finding a guardian angel. So in high school, for example, getting into accountancy, I had an accounting teacher who somehow, you know, took a very like vested interest in me to say, I'm going to teach you what accounting is about, what career opportunities are about. And as a matter of fact, I followed accountancy because I was influenced by her, which was, you know, a really great decision. And also having someone who's saying, I'm going to mentor you. You don't pay this person, you don't do anything for them, but somehow they just take an interest in you. And then from that, at university as well, I found a lady who was part of, you know, a bursary scheme that I was selected for. She was the program director. I mean, also she didn't have any responsibility to actually mentor any of us. But till this day, she has been so involved in my life to a point that she was even involved in my application process to HEC. So it's those kind of people that I always meet, which I don't think it's incidental, by the way. I think it's very intentional. It's all part of, you know, God's plan that I actually meet people along the way who contribute towards me achieving the next goal.
Well, I think your mother would have been very proud of you. You are nursing people's accounts, people's fashion style, so I'm sure she'd be very proud, as well as the other role models. What about you, Dawson?
Thank you, Daniel. I had the entirety of Tandy Wei's answer to think about, and I still can't really think of like people, which is kind of tough, but I'll answer it as best as I can. I think for me, it's not even so much people, but rather kind of, I've realized it's more certain things that I see in people, I'm looking for in people that I aspire to, or that, like, you know, I would try to be myself. But I think some big ones are, you know, leaders that I see who can project humility and vulnerability. So I think a big thing is people who are willing to stand up and, you know, be a lightning rod for change or improvement, but at the same time can sit there and say, hey, I don't know the best way, I don't really know what to do moving forward, but I'm willing to learn. So people that are just willing to be up there and just be publicly ignorant, but in a positive way, I think is huge. Another one that's important for me is also people who really take the time to formulate the relationships with those around them, so that, you know, leadership isn't so much you're in a collection of people, but rather there's like a degree of mandate where you are their leader because they've chosen you to be your leader, because they realize that you as their leader is the best person for them to put their beliefs and hopes in, and that you're the champion of their idea. You're the champion of that idea. So for me, I look up to people like that. And that's something that I would, you know, I think is very important.
I think a lot of people will identify, so it was a very diplomatic answer, and so publicly ignorant, and time to judge wisely within an organization who is a natural leader and the qualities necessary for that. Unfortunately, we're reaching our conclusion, and I'd like each person, each of the panelists to give their thoughts about the exchange we've had, and perhaps beyond it, and in reverse alphabetical order, to be fair. We'll start with Audrey Cherkov.
Can I just answer the previous question very, very quickly?
Sure.
I just want to talk about Indra Nooyi, because I have watched an interview of her, so when she was back at Pepsi, when she was the CEO of PepsiCo in the States. At that time, I was giving birth to my first daughter. I was traveling the world. I was the CEO myself of the company I was working for the past 10 years, working extremely hard, and I was feeling that I couldn't perform on the personal side nor on the professional side, because it was just too much. And I remember her, you know, saying to the journalist who was asking, so how are you coping? And she said, well, I'm not. I'm not. And it just felt good to hear that. So if I have a message to convey, if you feel that you're being drowned out because it's too much, you know, and you have your children, but your career is also very important, don't worry. In the end, it's all going to be fine. And the struggle is part of the adventure. Done. So
No problem.
To answer now the last question, maybe the message I'd like to share with you is about the time, because time is rolling for all of us at the same pace, right? Whether we sit, whether we sleep, whether we decide to do something, whether we decide not to do anything, time is rolling, and time is rolling fast. So at the end of the day, I think that it only comes down to one thing. It only comes down to to our energy. So to the level of energy we want to bring. Do we want to bring our energy to a level of intensity, of possibility that is going to make us, do in 1 year something that people are going to do in 10 years? So don't waste time.
Okay, that's a timely reflection. Tandiwe Mkishani, your final thoughts.
So for me, what I would like to just, leave with everyone, including myself, just as a reminder, is going back to the first point I mentioned around, how I would like us to, change how we think when we hear the word inclusion. It's broader than, gender. It's broader than just looking at the color of the skin, for example. So I just want to challenge all of us in this room and everyone, who's listening perhaps online, or everyone that we engage with, that, the decisions that we take, you need to stop and think, is it inclusive of everyone? And then there is actually a quote, I can't remember by who, but it says that if you can include the most or the most underrepresented person in the room, actually it's from Marcelle. It was from Marcelle. I think this is from a conversation I had with her where she said, if you make a decision and that decision includes the most underrepresented person in the room, then you are doing a great job. Then you've got it. So if we can all start thinking, like that with all the decisions that we are making, especially from a business environment, in corporates, the large corporates, where one decision is worth billions or trillions of when it comes to money, or the impact that it will have maybe on the non-financial side. So if you can just start thinking from that aspect and then coming back, not thinking about how much money we need to spend or how much money we are going to make. But as it was mentioned earlier, that when you start taking issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion very seriously, they actually work in your favor as a company. They work in your favor as a leader as well. And as a person, being a mom, brother, sister, when you start thinking like that, then you automatically see how many lives you can change around you.
Marcelle, naturally, it's over to you.
Well, it's a high place to start from. Engaging. I think the one thing that I want us all to take away is, how can I step up? What can I do? And can I be me? I think a lot of the work that we, when we talk about the corporate world, is all the labels that we put aside to just show up at work. But part of going to work is being me, and how do I bring that person to work? And so really that inclusive side of things resonates so strongly with me, because all these different people have different pathways that came to you, and how can they be them and ask questions. And sometimes that means that we're going to face some difficult questions. And it's not fun. But that's part of also growing. And if we don't create those spaces where everyone feels included and can just say, but why? I don't understand I don't understand what you're saying or why we're going that way, then I think part of our mission has failed in a sense. So those are my big takeaways. Thanks,
Marcelle. Dawson.
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah, I think my answer is actually very similar to Marcelle's in Tandiwe's. I kind of coming back to a lot of the ideas that we've said from the start. Basically, just the more experiences, the more perspectives you pull into your decision making, the more sound your decision making, the lesser the likelihood of you making a tunnel vision idea. I mean, if you really want to look at this as rational and devoid of emotional investment as you want to, it's simply just a logical thing that the more people you include, the more well-rounded the decision you're going to find. And the best way to go about that is simply make sure that everybody sitting at the table feels comfortable sharing their opinions, and that they all feel comfortable in that space to do so.
And finally, Shahina.
So 2 things. First of all, I would love not to be having this conversation in 10 years' time. Really, I think we all would, because there's so many other things we need to be talking about and focusing on. But I also want to finish off, and it really kind of wraps up what a lot of you have said, and this isn't a Marcelle quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes, which is, the harder I work, the luckier I get. And it's been attributed to all sorts of people. And the message in there is so important because we do talk about luck. I can't tell you how many times I've heard senior women saying, I was very lucky, and almost, handing away that power. We can't do everything, and we've talked today about a range of issues, and being engaging, burning out, all of these things, so critical. We need to be strategic and deliberate. We don't all need to crowd into the same space. We've actually got to spread, but being very deliberate, protecting ourselves, and being strategic about all the decisions we make. And the one thing we haven't talked about this at all, but one thing we also need to recognize, not just our role models, but who we support ourselves with, the partners we choose, not just at work, but our life partners. And how we build that resource to help us as women and also as men, the decisions we make, because these are all quite important. And I don't mean it to sound unemotional, but we need to be clear and think about what we're doing, because there's a lot of heavy lifting within this as well. So luck plays a role, but we work hard and we deserve what we get as well.
Well, my thanks to all 6 wonderful panelists around the table, and to the live audience, both here and online, for this very dense and engaging exchange that we've had. I would like to quickly thank also the people behind the camera and behind this whole operation. Emma Cochrane, who really was the inspiration for this exchange, and also her colleague Pierre-Louis Agbokou, who are both from the HEC Innovation and Entrepreneurship Center. The HEC Records team, featuring, of course, Oriane. Manon Fine, of the Imagine office that hosted us. Anisa and Alexandre from the HEC Communications team, who relayed through social networks all of this. And in terms of relaying, the technical team behind the cameras, Cédric and Alain, who are part of the HEC audiovisual team. My thanks. I do also hope that in 10 years' time there will be more urgent and prevalent questions being addressed by all of us. I think there's been record-breaking improvements that have been made in terms of female leadership in the past decades. But the magnitude of these developments show that there still is much more work to be done before this playing field is completely level. My thanks, goodbye, and thank you for sharing all of this with us. Thank you.